Texas Lutheran University.
I'd like to begin by thanking the two funds that provided the means that allowed us to invite Dr. Taylor to come and speak with us tonight. The Brandeis Fund for Religious Activities and the Brown Endowment. So this is the first of a two-lecture series that's in association with the course that Dr. Baer and I are teaching this semester on, it's a Global Perspectives, Democracies in Crisis, and we've been talking about the nature of totalitarianism in the 20th century. So tonight we're very honored to have Dr. Flagg Taylor. He's Associate Professor of Government at Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York. He has been doing research for the last few years on the Czech dissidents, and that's going to be the focus of his talk tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Taylor.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. First time in Texas. So far, I like it a lot. Had a great time with Jermaine and her family last night. Had a great lunch today. Talked about some of the things I'm going to talk tonight with some of Jermaine's colleagues, and then had a great class today with these great students, some and back. So I'm worried I have nowhere to go but down, but we'll see. I also just want to thank you for inviting me, and thank Professor Baer for, you're the big hero tonight, right? Coming from Hungary. I can't, I would have checked out. I can't say I would have done the same for you. Nice. I didn't intend that. It's good. And thanks to President Dorsey for coming. It's great to be here. Tonight I'm going to speak to you about the Czech dissident movement of the 1970s and 80s in communist governed Czechoslovakia. And I should clarify first that the word dissident is a bit problematic. The people who I'm going to talk about tonight, I think almost to a person would want to disavow that label. Their claim was that they weren't dissenting, they weren't the dissidents, it was the communists, the people who were ruling, that were dissenting from ordinary life and ordinary decency. So although I use that term, it's one that we use a lot. It's somewhat problematic, so I just wanted to add that. The reason that I'm interested in this subject and these people, one, they're extraordinarily admirable, honorable people. I think you'll come to agree by the end of the night. And I just think more people should know about them, more people should know about what they went through, why they did what they did, and we should sort of learn from them in a much more direct way than maybe we have in the past. There are a lot of dissidents who you probably heard. Vaclav Havel, who you'll see in a minute, is up there, but there are many admirable dissidents apart from Havel, so I hope to kind of bring some of those people out of the shadows tonight. My main argument is that we can learn important lessons, though, about the nature of liberty, and that it's useful looking at people who lived in conditions of tyranny to see how they acted and why they acted, and that can give us a pretty interesting perspective on what the meaning of liberty is and what it ought to be. In my talk tonight, I want to first set the stage, so to speak, by giving you a little bit of historical background. I'm not going to assume too much knowledge on your part about the history of this obscure Central European country, so let me say a few words about the history, and thereafter my talk will be comprised of 3 parts, and I'll explain what those 3 parts are in a moment. So first, just a little history. The 1970s and 80s in Czechoslovakia, the period that I'm going to focus on tonight, you can think of as the 3rd phase of communist rule. Communist rule began in a coup in 1948. The first phase, which corresponds roughly with 1948 to 1962 or 63, one could call the Stalinist phase. This is the phase that corresponds or is exemplified by kind of militant enthusiasm, ideological conformity, violence, and hope. The party asserted itself and secured its power by a really vast and impressive in its own way effort to discipline society and punish dissenters. There was a massive discrimination campaign based on social origin. So if you were, could be thought to have come from the working class, the proletarian class, you were usually okay. But if you had any hint of bourgeois background, as did Vaclav Havel, you were in a lot of trouble. Your family's assets would be seized, and lots of other not so nice things would happen to you. The party during this period also destroyed institutions like the Catholic Church, lots of show trials. The Slansky trial is the famous trial in Czechoslovakia where they purged famous communists and put them on trial for crimes that everyone knew that they didn't commit. Nonetheless, usually these people confessed, and it was a very big event. And people in ordinary workplaces across the country would have been made to affirmatively affirm the guilt of these people in a kind of public forum. Usually it happened in one's union, in a union meeting in one's workplace. So there was as one of my friends, Pavel Bertinka, put it to me, they made everyone in society participate in and affirm their crimes. They wanted everyone to become enveloped in this process of punishing dissidents, and even potential dissidents. The 1960s brought a gentler regime. This was when after Khrushchev's famous secret speech, where he denounced the crimes of the Stalinist period and its excesses, people who had been put on these show trials were rehabilitated, censorship was loosened, people were able to travel more, and so it was a gentler time in the middle 60s. The thing that people will remember most when you talk to them about this period is the fact that interesting books were available for the first time. So authors like Milan Kundera you could read. Havel had some of his plays published, and they were even performed in Prague. And so Czech society seemed to be slowly kind of regaining its feet. The decade culminated in an event called the Prague Spring. And this was a reform movement that was centered within the Communist Party. Its head was a guy named Alexander Dubček, a reformist communist. And it was dedicated to the cause of, quote, socialism with a human face. We can offer the world a new form of socialism that will be gentler, milder, more humane than it had been practiced in these countries up to then. In the winter and spring of 1968, the movement seemed to be gaining power, and the Czech hardliners and the Soviets started getting nervous. Hedda Kovály, in her memoir called Under a Cruel Star, it's a very short memoir, I recommend it highly if you are looking for literature on this period, she recalls the atmosphere in Prague during the spring of 1968. She says, quote, "It had all the intensity, anxiety, and unreality of a dream come true. People flooded the narrow streets of Prague's Old Town and the courtyards of Hadrani Castle and stayed long into the night. If anyone set out for a walk alone, he would soon join a group of others to chat or tell a joke, and we all would listen with relief as the ancient walls echoed with the sound of laughter. It was as if, quote, after all those years of isolation, people could not get enough of one another's company." This is a wonderful evocation of the hope and the expectation that people in Prague had in 1968. Well, by August of that summer, the Soviets had had enough. On the 21st of that month, they launched an invasion of over 150,000 troops, not all of them Russians, some from other Warsaw Pact countries. There was major violence and unrest for 7 days. If you go online, by the way, you can see dramatic pictures of what this looked like. Tanks in the streets of this ancient city, and burning buses because the Prague residents put up barricades, and they knocked out street signs to try to confuse the Soviet troops to prevent them from being able to navigate the city. That autumn, the reformers were purged from the upper echelons of the party. censorship was reintroduced and the presence of the Soviet troops was legalized. On January 16th, 1969, a young student from Charles University, Jan Palach, lit himself on the fire at the very top of Wenceslas Square to protest the presence of Soviet troops and to demand an end to censorship. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets for Palach's funeral. A few months later, the World Hockey Championships were played in Sweden, and the Czechs beat the Soviets twice in the span of 10 days, and this caused mass uprising and happiness and with a little violence on the side. I guess it's sort of like a university town in a big football town, right? After they win the national championship, but times 10, something like that. By the end of that month, the Soviet officials arrived and told their Czechoslovak counterparts to either restore order or another Warsaw Pact intervention would be necessary. And so Dubček, the head of this reform movement, was removed. Purges were conducted in the upper echelons of the party. The powers of the secret police were increased. More censorship was imposed, and anything that smacked of an independent social organization was abolished. Different writers' unions had been established. In the 60s, all those went away with the flash of an eye almost. To secure the unity and order that the party required, they set upon a really remarkable undertaking. And this is something that has not, I think, received enough attention in the history books and is not spoken about enough. Really, really impressive, awfully impressive, but impressive in its own way. The party implemented what they called a massive screening process. And so over the course of a couple of years, they interviewed either in person or via questionnaire every party member. So this is about 1.6 million people, plus anyone who worked in state institutions, not necessarily members of parties. So we're talking about close to 5 million people in total. People came before the screening board, and they would be asked about their attitudes about events like the hockey championships or the Palach self-immolation, what they would do in the future to secure the leading role of the party, or, most importantly, if they agreed with the, quote, fraternal assistance of the Soviet armies. There's only one answer to that question. Estimates vary, but the result of this massive screening process was that close to 400,000 people lost their membership in the party. Now, this could happen in either two ways. You could be expelled, which is the worst. This is sort of the worst circle of hell. And your membership, you'd be utterly stricken from the party. Lose your job, you'd have to work. If you're a university professor, then you'd be found as a garbage collector or something the next day. Your children's education would probably be removed. And then there was a slightly less drastic punishment called cancellation, which involved less dramatic consequences usually, but most of the time some familial consequences in terms of your children's education. So this process continued, the screening process. And so this was a really public, massive shaming of the population. And it had a dramatic effect. The result of all this was that the party was satisfied with loyalty from the population, not caring much whether it was sincere or merely feigned. So most people, after the screening process, decided that they should go along to get along, right? And mouth the right platitudes, go to the right meetings, in exchange for being left alone. And this is described by lots of historians as the Czechs started to have this, what's referred to as a cottage culture. They started to build or repair these small, tiny cottages in the countryside and retreat there on the weekends where they would be hopefully out of the range of the secret police microphones, out of the range of having to go to meetings. And so it was a massive kind of turning away from anything that smacked of politics. There was also a huge bulge in the birth rate during this period. They're called Husak's children. Husak was the general secretary of the party, as the Czech government gave grants for people who were having children. And so people really did retreat as much as they could inward to this small circle of family and friends. And they scratched out a decent life as best as they could, but of course they all knew that they were being watched. And the secret police, or the STB, kept careful watch on everyone. They kept a personnel file on everyone in the country. Family history, work history, any embarrassing details that might be used against you publicly. This was all in this file. And everyone knew that they had one. Vaclav Havel wrote about this pacified population in 1975. He says, quote, "Most people are loath to spend their days in ceaseless conflict with authority, especially when it can only end in the defeat of the isolated individual. So why not do what is required of you? It costs you nothing, and in time you cease to bother about it. It's not worth a moment's thought." I think that captures the attitude of most people. The most troubling thing, as one dissident put it to me, was the sense that this could last forever. And as he said, if hell lasts forever, it makes no sense to try to escape. Why not just manage as best you can within it? And this was the attitude. Beaten down, pacified population that was utterly cynical about politics. And so much for the conditions, the historical conditions in which these dissidents operated. Now what I want to talk about is the principles and activities that these dissidents adopted. And my argument is that their activities and principles can be understood using a kind of threefold framework. And so the first part is called law and publicity. The second part is called citizenship and fraternity. And the third part is called truth in word and deed. So I want to sort of use that framework to think about what these individuals did and why they did what they did. So as you all probably know, the Czech dissidents are mainly known for their starting of this organization called Charter 77 in 1977. The charter was released on January 1st. It had 243 initial signatories. I've just called it an organization, but it explicitly disavowed that label. It claimed, quote, "It has no rules, no permanent bodies or formal membership, and it describes itself as a loose, informal, open association of people of various shades and opinions, faiths, and professions. What unites the group is a, quote, will to strive individually and collectively for the respecting of civil and human rights." And what the charter did was seize on the fact that the Warsaw Pact countries had been parties to what are known as the Helsinki Accords of 1975, which in exchange for the West recognizing the borders that had been imposed after World War II that the Soviets liked, which in the West was looked upon grimly, that this was a kind of acquiescence to this unjust order. In exchange, the West got the Warsaw Pact signatories to sign on to these accords and thus grant a series of civil and human rights to their populations. They would incorporate these international components into their particular national constitutions. At the time, this seemed silly, right? No one really thought these Warsaw Pact countries would ever do anything close to in any meaningful way, right, to make their governments act in accordance with these rights, but fair enough. The charter argued that the Czech government had to take these seriously. This had been incorporated into Czechoslovak law, and therefore Czechoslovak citizens were entitled to these rights. And it was the state's duty to ensure that such rights were secured and respected for its people. And so the charter very boldly and naively announced, you have to abide by your own laws. These are meaningful things. We can point to the moment when they were incorporated by the Czech Parliament into the statutory law of the Czech nation. You need to act in such a way that's consistent with them. And it took advantage of the statutory right in Czechoslovak law, the right to petition, to announce that the government had to do this. And thus the charter encouraged Czechoslovak citizens to take the law seriously and to use whatever possible legal appeals they could to their own advantage. On the one hand, right, the seizing of this mantle of the law and the principle of law-abidingness was shrewd, and it might have had broad appeal in attracting citizens to the cause. The problem, as you probably could predict, right, is the Czechoslovak penal code was so ambiguous was that they would always provide government officials with a pernicious latitude in their implementation. So the Polish philosopher Kolakowski has this thought on totalitarian law and how it's practiced. He says, the law had to be so vague that, quote, its application might hinge on the arbitrary and changing decisions of the executive authorities, so that each citizen should be considered a criminal whenever those authorities thought to convict him. So, for example, Article 98 of the Czech Penal Code, as I discussed with the students in class today, was something called subversion of the republic, defined as acting, quote, out of hostility to the socialist and governmental systems of the republic, against its territorial integrity, defensive capacity or independence, or against its international interest, right? Way too much latitude. So, despite the fact that Charter 77 was technically legal, the regime refused to acknowledge this, and it undertook a particularly vicious media campaign in the late winter and spring of 1977. This was the anti-charter campaign. They imprisoned lots of people, took people out into the woods and beat them up, offered lots of people the chance to emigrate, which some people took them up on. So they were successful in really isolating this movement from the population more broadly. The result was that some of these charter members rushed to the defense of their fellow dissidents, and in doing so, they discovered another key element of their strategy. This was called what I'll call publicity. And this story begins with a party or a ball. The Railway Workers' Ball, the Railway Workers' Union, decided it would hold a winter party in January of 1978. And Vaclav Benda said that it's bad for your health, it's bad for the dissidents' health to meet only at funerals and court buildings. We should go to the party. So he encouraged all his fellow dissidents to get snazzed up, buy some dresses and suits, and they would have a decent night out. Well, the STB got wind of this and guarded the entrance and refused the dissidents' entrance. In some cases, they took them away across the street and beat them up, made lots of arrests, and it was a rough night. It was not a pleasant party night for the dissidents. 3 people were detained by the police, Havel being one of them and 2 others. And the dissidents formed a committee to protest the imprisonment of these 3, and it was called the Committee to Protest the Imprisonment of Havel, Kukal, and very creative title, right? Kukal and Landowski. And they circulated letters, and they publicized the fact that these guys had been unjustly imprisoned. They sort of went door to door, sent letters, did everything they could, got word out to Amnesty International organizations like this to put as much public pressure on the regime as they could. And in 6 weeks, the 3 men were released. It seemed to work. And so they thought, well, if it worked for this group, maybe it'll work for everyone. So they formed a group that is known by its Czech acronym VONS, which the acronym means the Committee to Defend the Unjustly Persecuted. And in April of 1978, they formed this group and publicized their intent to come to the aid of anyone unjustly persecuted by the political authorities. 17 people signed the VONS declaration. They vowed that they would go to the trial of anyone who they thought was unjustly persecuted, raise money to support the families of people, get word out to the Voice of America, Amnesty, do all these things. It was very labor-intensive work, right, before email and cell phones. It took lots of running around Prague, and of course, all under the watchful eye of the secret police. And soon word got out that there were 3 addresses in Prague where you could go, people who were members of VONS. You could always go for help. And the Benda address, Václav Benda is one of the people I'm going to talk about later, was one of these addresses in Charles Square. And Václav's wife, Camilla, told me a funny story about this. Her husband, Václav, was in prison from 1979 to 1983. She, nonetheless, although she had 6 children, husband in prison, continued this practice of welcoming anyone and anyone who had a problem with the regime to come into her flat. And I said, well, this is interesting. Your children must have gotten used to strange people in the flat. She said, yeah, they loved it. It was a big adventure, 17 people a day. You know, they thought it was great, meeting new and strange people from all over the country. She did admit to me, she said, well, Vaclav was in prison. This was tough to manage the six kids. So I arranged it that Tuesdays and Thursdays were widely known as visiting days. She sort of put the word out, just Tuesdays and Thursdays. But she said one day someone came to the door on a Monday and not intending to visit, but he walked up and he said, Mrs. Benda, when are the visiting days again? And she said, oh, they're Tuesdays and Thursdays. And he said, oh, well, there'll be too many people that day, so I'm going to come on Wednesday. So this was just something that she got used to and expected. Oh, we lost this. I'll show you a picture of the, oh, you want to sign in for me? So this is a picture of the outgoing and incoming charter spokesman at the Benda flat. You see Vaclav Havel, you probably recognize on your left. Jerzy Dean Spear next to Havel. Ladislav Hedanek next to him. Václav Benda is in the back on my right. Jerzy Hayek is on the bottom left, and Zdena Tominova is the woman in the bottom. And this is taken in the winter of '79 in the Benda flat. And that's a charter meeting where they're talking about something important. You can tell they're all very focused and concentrating. So that's law and publicity, coming to the aid of people. So this was an important moment, right? Because this was a contrast with the 1950s, when people really could just disappear without a trace. Right now, this group, the charter group in Vons, made it really unlikely that someone could disappear without them ever being heard from again. Second sort of set of principles I want to emphasize, I call citizenship and fraternity, and this was the effort to repoliticize the population. It might seem strange that I'm talking about repoliticization as a solution to the problems of totalitarianism, right? Everyone knows that totalitarian regimes are hyper-political. Politics is everywhere, right? Nonetheless, this doesn't capture the phenomenon perfectly because the hyper-political atmosphere that prevails in a totalitarian regime is political, but only in a kind of sophistical way. It's a kind of game. It's a pseudo-politics. And everyone knows it's kind of this false facade. And so it's not the case that people are really coming together, when they do come together in social and political groups, to deliberate, right, to really discuss things. Rather, if they do come together as a result of these official structures, they say exactly what they think should be said, right? And so what I want to emphasize now is the charter's effort to offer different ways that people really could come together and sincerely congregate and discuss political issues and act in common. And this is a difficult task, right? Because people feel very isolated. They feel very beaten down. And so getting people to have a taste again for politics, to really come together, was quite difficult. Benda once described the widespread cynicism about politics in this way, quote, "The system of two truths has been brought to perfection in contemporary Czechoslovakia, far outstripping that of the 1950s, and even, in a sense, Orwell's doublethink." So he thought it was worse than Orwell. He says, "On the outside, everyone is committed to agreement, optimism, and periodic rejoicing. Behind closed doors, middle party cadres and STB officers not accepted express themselves negatively, pessimistically, and with deep skepticism. Believing in communism has become just as dangerous as speaking one's minds about it. All those fanatics have to be eliminated." right? So even the true believers were distrusted at this point, right? Because they couldn't really think what they purported to think. So this is the movement, this is the population that the Charter 77 movement confronted. The problem was that this morally righteous stance of the Charter couldn't be self-sustaining, right? You couldn't expect people to protest the imprisonment of this or that person in a letter and put themselves in danger in doing so. It was a lot to ask of people. A mere casual, this will make the point, I think, in even starker terms. A mere casual conversation with someone who was associated with the Charter could lead to an interrogation by the secret police. So more than one signatory told me that when they walked on the street, in order to protect their friends, people who weren't involved in the Charter, to protect them from the odd chance that they might be interrogated, they would avoid eye contact with their friends. So they made eye contact that the STB might see, and therefore the next day they would find themselves at the police station. I'm going to pass around this book now. This is a book called Prague Through the Lens of the Secret Police. And these are all photos that were taken by the STB of people. I'll give you a sense of the extent to which this spying operation on the population, how truly extensive it was. You'll see I've highlighted a couple photos. One, you'll see pictures of Milan Kundera. He was followed, and then also pictures of a guy called Timothy Garton Ash, who's a commentator that some of you might have read. So I'll just pass this around from table to table. So the Charter needed to find a way to offer something concrete to the community, something that would transform its noble and just moral stance into a meaningful political and social force. And so Václav Benda put forward the idea of what he called the parallel polis. And this was the idea that the Charter community would help society create parallel social structures to the official structures. And he meant things like the cultural sphere, right? So you have Samizdat, a vast publishing operation that existed underground that would work alongside the official sphere, black market economy, right? And the Charter had to encourage the development of these parallel structures, which would then offer people a kind of concrete space where communal life could really reassert itself. All of this would take a self-conscious effort to bring information about these activities to a wider circle of people, right? And this was, of course, difficult because the wider circle of people then entailed risk that informants would get wise to this. So it was always this double game of widening the circle, but also widening in a way that you were careful about with whom you could trust this information. Benda argued that all this was worth the risk, that you really had to push the boundaries of what might be accepted. He thought, although the state's claim was total, and it was dedicated to crushing any hint of free activity, he knew that this total claim was unrealizable. And he argued that there was a, quote, natural resistance of life to totalitarianism. People would naturally seek out places, kind of carve out spaces to assert their freedom. The problem was this natural resistance to totalitarianism was something that was fragile. And without the parallel polis, without the affirmative support of the dissidents, these spaces could be crushed. And so this is the quote where he tried to explain this contrast. He says, the natural resistance is like a cluster of flowers that has grown in a place accidentally sheltered from the killing winds of totalitarianism and easily destroyed when those winds change direction. The parallel polis is a trench whose elimination depends strictly on a calculated move by the state power to destroy it. Given the time and the means available, only a certain number of trenches can be eliminated. If, at the same time, the parallel polis is able to produce more such trenches than it loses, a situation arises that is mortally dangerous for the regime. It is a blow to the very heart of its power. I could talk about a ton of activities that you could put under the umbrella of this parallel polis. But let me just mention two quickly, and if you guys have questions more about this line in the question and answer period, I'll be happy to go into more detail. One was the network of underground seminars. And this was an effort to provide a completely underground and alternative educational sphere to the official stultifying education that existed in Charles University and the official structures, which was dominated by Marxist-Leninism and ideological orthodoxy. And if you wanted to get a serious education in almost anything, the sciences were partly an exception. You couldn't go to the official university. And so these seminars, these underground seminars, were held in private flats. They were often run by professors who had been expelled. And one young former professor even wrote a letter to Harvard, Oxford, and I think the University of Heidelberg, and begged Westerners to come visit the seminars to provide lectures sort of like the one I'm giving you today. And this was an effort that was that grew over the course of the 1980s. And so Richard Rorty, Jacques Derrida, those are some of the big name Western academics who came, but lots of people in lots of different disciplines came to visit these underground seminars and were dedicated to helping this educational enterprise. The second institution that's worth mentioning here is the church. The communists were particularly brutal in their repression of the Catholic Church. Masses of priests and bishops did long stretches in the uranium mine camps in the 1950s to perform one's priestly office, perform mass, hear confessions. You needed a specific license from the state, and you could only do it in the actual church building. And so something called the underground church started, and they ordained priests and bishops in secret. I can talk more about this in the question and answer period, but they ordained married men, specifically for the reason that they didn't think these men would be suspected of being priests. There were even some women that were ordained as priests. To give you an example of the difficulties faithful Catholic confronted, the Benda's youngest daughter was born, Marketa was born in 1984, and they wanted Marketa to be baptized. And they went to their parish priest, and he declined to perform the baptism because he thought he would be punished if he baptized a Benda. And so the Bendas went to the Archbishop Tomaszek to ask, and he agreed to perform the baptism. So let me see. So this is this is Hradčany Square in Prague. This is the Benda family going to baptize Marketa on the day. And that's a picture of the baptism with the Archbishop. Over time, this underground church and even the rehabilitation somewhat of the official church had quite an effect. A Samizdat bulletin called Information About the Church was circulated widely, said to have tens of thousands of readers. In July of 1985, about 150,000 took part in a pilgrimage to Velorad to commemorate the 1001st death of St. Methodius, the missionary to the Slavs. And then in 1987, a 31-point petition calling for the restoration of religious freedom was able to attract almost 500,000 signatures. So something that started out that looked like it was pretty hopeless turned into a pretty significant social force by the end of the 80s. Finally, we come to the third and final part of my framework. This is truth in word and deed. And so I spoke in the last part about repoliticization. Now I'm going to talk about the effort to remoralize the population, remoralization. There's a phrase of Vaclav Havel's, and it comes from his most famous essay called The Power of the Powerless. In that essay, Havel urged his fellow citizens to live in truth or live within the truth. And this he opposed to what a totalitarian regime asks of its citizens, to live within the lie. The imposition of the lie is in Havel's words, meant one's submission to this all-encompassing ideology, right? That everyone display the ideology's tenets, that everyone pretend that the ideology reflected the truth about the world, right? And there was no end to when you could stop doing this. And this, for Havel, was the distinguishing feature of a totalitarian regime. He explains how this works using the example of a greengrocer or an ordinary shopkeeper. And this happened. People have told me this was not something that he just invented, but this was required. He says, each morning, your average shopkeeper in Prague hangs a sign up in his window, and the sign says, "Workers of the world unite." And Havel asks in the essay, what does the shopkeeper think when he's hanging up the sign every morning? What does he intend to communicate with the sign? And Havel says, well, he likely doesn't think much about it. He certainly doesn't think that the workers of the world are actually going to unite. So what does he do? Why does he do it? He says he does it out of habit. He does it because all of the shopkeepers do it. And what the sign really says to passersby and other shopkeepers is, I am obedient. I'm not going to make trouble for anyone. And Havel argues that all of these signs and all of these shops create a kind of panorama. They give an impression of general agreement and uniformity, right? We all agree with what's going on. And so Havel argues, quote, the essence of totalitarianism is that it draws everyone into its sphere of power so that they may surrender their human identity in favor of the identity of the system, so that they may become agents of the system's general automatism and the servants of its self-determined goals. So in Havel's view, what this does, it's sort of an evil genius strategy, right? It makes everyone an accomplice in their own oppression, right? Everyone has to join in the affirmation of this ideological message. So everyone's simultaneously a victim, but also an agent. And this is true of everyone, Havel thinks, from the highest functionaries to the low-level shopkeeper. Everyone's a victim and an agent, but obviously different degrees of that depending on how high you up are in the hierarchy. And Havel emphasizes, right, that no one actually has to believe the sign, but if you behave as if you believe it, that's good enough. And so the great paradox is that the strength of communist tyranny lies precisely in its ability to implicate everyone into the maintenance of its own power. The good news for Havel was that that means that the seemingly powerless do have power, because seemingly minor actions, let's say if the shopkeeper decided one day to take down the sign, that sends a pretty significant message. And if more people started doing these minor things, these little pebbles, right, might one day have an effect. The widespread acceptance of this bargain, right, and putting the sign up in your window in exchange for being left alone, for Havel was evidence of a profound moral crisis in society, that everyone was willing to make this bargain. And so Havel argues that someone who had no sense of responsibility for anything higher than his own survival is a, quote, demoralized person. And so Havel thought part of the task of the dissidents was to remind people that they had the power to kind of reawaken themselves to this corrupt bargain that they had made, and encourage people to find a way to recapture their identity and their responsibility, and to assert that against making these moral compromises every day. And this I think you'll find, I think, that Havel's explanation is not specific to Czechoslovakia. There's a Polish writer named Miloš who talks about the way that people survived in communist regimes was by becoming actors. He says they would send out a self into the public, and that actor self would do all the necessary things and speak in all the right ways, and then they would retreat into private where they could speak more freely. What Havel suggests, though, is that the strategy, and I think he would agree with Milos that this is the strategy that people had, that can only work for so long. That at a certain point, one of these selves tends to win out. People can't live in this kind of bifurcated way forever. And during my interviews, when I've asked people the simple question about what really has led them down this path of confrontation with the regime, there's been a consistent thread of responses. You hear some, and even one of the students in class said almost verbatim this today, so she even recognized this. Some version of I just couldn't live with myself anymore. That they were making themselves sick. So it wasn't that they felt a sense of necessarily responsibility for society, or they thought they could bring down the communist regime, but just that for their own integrity, that's why they did it. There was a critique of Havel, and the critique went something like this, that all this talk of living in truth and integrity sounds fine if you're a kind of intellectual, and it sounds fine if you really know and understand the potential consequences of what you're doing, right? But what if you're a naive 20-year-old and you do something like take down a sign and you find yourself in jail for 5 years? That could ruin someone's life. So the argument was that Havel was being too naive about the consequences, and he was sort of egging people on into undertaking actions which they really weren't prepared to deal with the full weight of what those consequences would be. Broadly speaking, the response to this critique was that it mistakenly focused on the question of consequences. Simply put, that it was impossible to predict the response of the regime to one's actions and the likely effect of those actions. If you're going to try to recapture your integrity or put your own soul in order, that has to be pursued for its own sake. And if you went down this road where you started to worry about the consequences, you could talk yourself out of it pretty quickly. And that's exactly what the regime wanted you to do. Benda did think that it wasn't enough to tell people to kind of recapture their integrity and to undertake this moral stance. He did think it was important that that moral stance be able to find expression in concrete activities where people would really find meaning in social groups, in communal groups. And so that's why I think the parallel polis is so important, that people connect this moral stance, sort of abstract moral stance that's hard to sell in a way, to offering people a concrete sense of a vibrant community in which they could participate, and in which that would replace the kind of emptiness that they felt because they were living in this very hyper-individualistic society in a way. And this is why these underground lectures were just so important. If you ask people about their feelings about what they remember from those lectures, the people who sat in these private flats and listened to people talk about Plato's dialogues, or a lecture about architecture, or a lecture about classical music, they'll usually use the metaphor, it was like a light in the darkness. And the sense of community, the sense of togetherness they felt in those rooms, they sort of start fumbling, and they can't put it into words, but you can sort of feel the meaningfulness that they're trying to pass to you when they talk about it. If you want to get a sense of these underground seminars, there's a wonderful novel recently published about a year ago by Roger Scruton, who's a British philosopher who was responsible for administering the foundation that sent these Westerners into these private seminars. He wrote a wonderful novel called Notes from Underground that draws on his experiences in these seminars. So, again, my threefold framework. First, law and publicity. Second, citizenship and fraternity. And third, truth and integrity. It seems to me that together they constitute a plausibly comprehensive understanding of various dimensions of liberty. You have liberty understood as liberty under law, which requires publicity. It requires seeing what the law is, people knowing and understanding, right, what the law permits. Liberty, understood as related to citizenship and fraternity, right, is about initiative and common action. It's about people having a desire for community, right? They want to be with their fellow citizens. And the ability to actually act together in meaningful ways, to come together with a common purpose and to have that purpose actually be reflected, right, in the society at large. And that's what the parallel polis sought to activate and secure. And finally, this truth in word and deed, liberty requires a self-conscious devotion to the cultivation of one's own spiritual well-being. You have to look inward and think about your own spiritual well-being at some level. And this is what the Czech philosopher and one of the first charter spokesmen, Jan Patočka, called the care of the soul. This was how he defined sort of the core of European civilization. He was one of the people who was expelled from Charles University and directed a long-running underground seminar in his own flat until he died of heart failure as a result of the interrogation by the secret police. Martin Paloš, who was a former charter signatory, he was actually the ambassador from the Czech Republic to the United Nations in the early 2000s. He later remarked, quote, "Those who signed the founding declaration of Charter 77 may have been initially motivated, like Socrates, by the desire to live in peace with their own souls, in unity with themselves. They discovered, however, in the course of events, that launching into this adventure was not a mere matter of personal integrity, constituted in the silent dialogue between me and myself. They discovered rather what it means to leave the protected walls of one's private life and to step into the public arena and call on one's fellows." Justice for many of these Czechs did seem to become the soul's deepest good. Yet justice as devotion to truth against lies could not remain satisfied by a turning inward. True justice could not be achieved by shielding oneself from the noxious winds of totalitarianism. In the view of Václav Benda, he argued that care for the soul must entail care for the community, and that the goods of the soul are experienced most deeply by putting things in common once again. The story of the charter community and the thoughts and deeds of its participants ought to be a continuing source of reflection as we look back on the horrors of the 20th century. Thank you. I actually forgot in the excitement of my talk, I forgot to show you a few more of these pictures. Jermaine, could you log back in? I have some pictures of STB photos up here. But if you guys want to ask questions while I'm waiting to do that. Yeah.
Have you thought about how this three-part model might apply to other authoritarian, maybe other authoritarian Eastern European countries, or broader?
A little bit. I mostly tried to apply the model to this case. I was working hard on that. I was thinking a little bit about it, though, and I thought I was thinking about the difference between how the model might look, not in a totalitarian country, but an authoritarian country. And in an authoritarian country where there isn't this all-pervasive ideology, and there's less emphasis on that, I think the law and publicity strategy could actually work much better, right? That the publication of publicity and insistence on the rule of law is likely to have a more dramatic effect. So that was my first thought. But in other totalitarian countries, I haven't thought about that yet. So, but it's a good suggestion. I'll show you a few more of these. So this is Jan Patočka on the left, the philosopher, and he's with Jerzy Hayek. And see, these are two of the three first charter spokesmen, and so that picture was taken in January, February of 1977, right after the publication of the charter, so that's why the STB would have been following them. On the right, this is in Charles Square. The woman in glasses on the right is Kamila Bendova, and that's Zdena Timinova on the left. So this this picture, I think, was taken in the early 80s when Vaclav was in prison. And usually, and this is true also of lots of those pictures in the book, when you see the black border around the edge of the picture, that usually means that the photograph was taken from like a suitcase or something that would have hidden the camera. And this is Pavel Bratinka. This is his, the name of his file is Brother One. Bratinka is a brilliant guy who learned English at a very young age and started going to the American embassy to read things in his early 20s. And he did this so routinely and so often that they didn't really bother him about it because he just did it all the time. But he's outside of the embassy, that's him in the hat, reading a newspaper. And you can see that that's a STB officer behind him looking at him while his picture's being taken from across the street. And that's Vaclav and Kamila Bendova leaving their flat. So I think that picture was taken in the middle 80s after he was released from prison. And that's me with Mrs. Bendova a few years ago in that same flat at the meeting. Smoking is very popular in the Czech Republic. Yeah.
You talked about how did you do this research? So did you go to Czechoslovakia? How did you find these people? Tell me a little bit about your method.
Yeah. It's not. It's you'll be disappointed. It's hard to call it even a methodology. It's me getting in touch with a few of my friends who had written about Havel. The community, Czech Republic now, right? They split in '93, but it's a small country, and the charter community is a pretty small community, and so I found that once you make contact with a few people, everyone knows everyone, and they're, with a few exceptions, they're very open to talking and sharing their thoughts with me about almost anything. Most of them speak English, and it's easy to get a translator because my Czech is not fluent yet. So yeah, my methodology is just, I started out with really none, but then as the research has progressed and I've become convinced that there's more to be written about than I had imagined. I've tried to approach it in terms of activities, right? So I've interviewed people about Vaughn's, this one organization, last June, and then hopefully in a future trip, if I can get the funding, I'm going to really focus on the underground church. So my approach has been kind of directed by institution or theme, and trying to get a feel for a particular activity. and that's pretty easy, and in a lot of cases, there's a lot of cross-pollination, right? So the people who are in the underground church were also in the charter, and so there's no elaborate methodology. Yeah.
About research methodology, I'm just curious how they feel about, say, signing a form that says they give their informed consent to you to interview them. Because when I was doing interview research in the former Soviet Union,
Yeah.
people were really uncomfortable about signing anything that looked like an official.
Yeah. I have given them no form. I've just asked them to talk to me. So that's been the extent of it. I don't know if that would have scared them off. I'm not sure. I just tell them I'm doing research for a book, and they share their thoughts, yeah.
Well, just ask you to speculate a little bit, following up on Dan's question. You're following a very long history of a country that was under totalitarianism and marched toward democracy. So, of course, there's been a lot of discussion about where's the world headed? Is this 21st century, is this the decade of democracy?
Yeah.
Or is totalitarianism now
Coming back or something? Yeah.
Speculate a little bit about based on what's happened in Czechoslovakia, about
Yeah.
the rest of the world.
Wild speculation. I mean, I guess I would say I'll answer the question in this way. On the one hand, I think the Czech Republic is doing pretty well, economically and politically, by comparison with some other countries. To the extent that there are problems, I think the problems are in part due to the legacy of totalitarianism. So I spoke about, this effort to repoliticize the population, to kind of get people to trust one another and to want to come together in groups. I think that's happened in part in the private sphere, in civil society. I think you could say there's a pretty vibrant civil society. But I think there's still a legacy of pretty widespread cynicism and distrust in politics in general. Pavel Bratinka has told me that it's still hard to get people motivated and interested and to think to really engage themselves in meaningful, long-standing ways in politics. And so my suspicion is that's just going to take a long time for that legacy to be overcome. So I don't think there's a simple answer in terms of how to do it. I think the Czechs seemed, from my standpoint, to be moving in a pretty healthy direction. But there's just still a pretty healthy distaste for and distrust for politics, and I think that's just the legacy of communism. And whether maybe that goes away when the older generation that actually experienced it starts passing away, but I'm not sure, because from what I've heard, younger people are also pretty cynical about it. So, yeah.
Just kind of following up on that, what is the role of the media in Czechoslovakia? What has it been? What would we experience if we went over there?
Yeah, I mean, beyond that, I'm not sure that if you talk to your average citizen, they would say that they're happy with their media, but from an outsider's perspective, it's not. I don't feel like there's gaping holes in it, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Earlier you were talking about how Victor was kind of arrested and his wife was still letting people in on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Yeah.
So if this was so widespread, shouldn't the police have known about it? And even if they did, why didn't they take any action?
Yeah, I'm sure they knew about it, and I'm sure they took action occasionally. The problem is there was a downside. If they took action, they knew that the Bendas and the people around them had the capacity and the contacts necessary to get the word out to the foreign media pretty quickly. right? So this was a constant game between the STB and the members of this community. They knew there were informants. The Bendas knew that there were informants in their midst. And sometimes they would purposefully feed the informants false information, right? Sort of counterintelligence within the community. So it's just a game of back and forth. And, the regime and the STB knew that they had to be careful about what they did precisely because they knew Benda and Havel and Dean Spear and all these people could get news out to the Voice of America pretty quickly. And so, they could take action to punish someone or repress someone, but they had to keep in mind the danger that would become public knowledge and there would be public pressure on them, by Western governments. And did they want that media attention? So it was this kind of back and forth game, yeah.
Then why did they still arrest him for 3 years?
Yes, so 6 members of Vaughn's were arrested in various sentences, but he was arrested for 4 years. Well, they made the calculation that maybe if they put these main figures in prison, maybe they won't be replaceable. If you make an example of these guys, maybe people will be reluctant to step up and fill their shoes. So they hoped. Didn't work. When Bender was released from prison, the day that he came home and he walked into his flat, that very minute he was handed a petition to sign, and his wife said to him, she told me this was the first thing she said to him: "You have to resume your position as charter spokesman so that the regime will know that your imprisonment had no effect." That was the first thing she said. I just think that's astounding. Strong lady. I'd be like, "Come home, honey. Deal with the children. Can't take them anymore." Yeah. What was the reason that they refused to what? What do you mean by accept? Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But here, we have in our county an 11% voter turnout for a non-presidential election. And we have the whole bowling alone hypothesis.
Right.
So is this something that's connected to coming out of totalitarian rule, or is it something else?
Yeah.
Because we're very Catholic.
Yeah. I guess I would push back a little bit that what you say is certainly right to an extent, but I think there's a pretty, vibrant nonprofit, civic sector, voluntary sector in the United States, and Putnam may be right, but...
In our area, the people who are active in a lot of voluntary organizations are retired, and the food bank has trouble getting enough people to staff.
Yeah.
Because they're dying.
Right.
So how vibrant is the volunteer sector?
It's an international trend. It's a trend, and then it's more pronounced. So those same international, whatever those trends are, dynamics are present there. But it's more pronounced.
Yeah. I guess I would too agree that you'd say what Tocqueville speaks about individualism, right? That's a phenomenon of modern democracy, and it's not, that's not the legacy, obviously, of totalitarianism. So, I think that's right. And even Hannah Arendt would argue in sympathy with your conjecture. She makes the case that totalitarianism is possible in the first place only because of kind of this modern feeling of isolation and helplessness, and so, it's that, in a way, that precedes totalitarianism. So I think that's possible. Yeah.
You've given us a flavor, a sense of women in this effort, and a few moments ago talked about
Yeah.
Can you say more about gender and women's role?
Yeah. So Mrs. What I hope to communicate in the book is that a lot of the charter members the majority of them for sure were male. This was, and Camilla Bendova, the woman I've spoken about, did not herself sign the charter, in part because usually the thought was that there needed to be one person in the household who was able to earn a decent living, right, and not get themselves into trouble. So she had a job. She's a mathematician and worked in the Czech Academy of Sciences and was able to earn a decent wage while her husband was fired from every job he ever had. And how I've put it in other places is that in some sense the heroic actions of some of the more prominent male charter figures is really only possible because of people like Camilla Bendova, the women. Their willingness to do what she did while her husband was in prison, and keep, she kept the Vaughan's committee working. She continued to let people come to her home. She continued to transcribe documents and all this stuff. And that's not true. I mean, that's not only true of the Benda house, but is also true of lots of other households. And so the women really did take on a really important, and I would say in no way, secondary role. It really wouldn't have been possible without them. The other thing the other task that was usually done by women that was critically important to this whole enterprise, this is going to seem strange, was typing. Because the way that these pamphlets and Samizdat literature was reproduced was on a typewriter, and they would put, the 12 pieces of the onion paper, and behind the carbon paper, and that's how they yielded these 12 copies. This was incredibly risky to be a typist, because if you were caught with any of this material, probably sent to prison. And they did this for very low wages, sometimes for free, not usually for free, because it took a long time to type these novels and pamphlets and bulletins and whatnot. And so these women typists were incredibly heroic, and without them, none of this stuff is possible, because it's all predicated on getting information out to all of these people. So that's just one example. But they played roles as couriers and all sorts of things. And of course, there are some, as Zdena Timinova, who was a spokesperson, so there were some that played a more prominent role as sort of leading figures. But sometimes the leading figures were protected because the regime knew that if they arrested someone really famous, that would get them too much publicity. So it was actually sometimes riskier to play one of these minor roles, because then you might, if you're a typist, who's going to make a big stink about your imprisonment, right? So it's a good question. Yes?
On a day when my biggest economic decision is whether or not to eat dessert at lunch or dinner or something like that.
Or both for me today.
I wish you would give me some idea about what you tell your students in terms of ways in which they might engage in supporting dissident movements across the world in other countries.
Yeah. Right. I don't. The sad answer is I don't have an answer to that, really. I've started to think about how I can apply what I've learned about what the Czech dissidents did, and use that and can maybe communicate it to dissidents in other countries. In some sense, this has already happened. In China, they imitated the charter movement. It was called Charter, I think, 09. And so they've sort of fashioned themselves very, very much in sympathy with the Charter 77 movement. And one of my students actually this year wants to do a thesis about whether Havel's philosophy of living in truth can it be applied to a place like Cuba? And the guy that the person that I quoted at the end of my talk, Martin Palos, he teaches at Florida International University and runs a Vaclav Havel Foundation. I know he does a lot of work on behalf of the Cubans. Because of Havel, there was a kind of deep connection between Havel and Cuba, and I think that's continued. That the Czech Republic, in general, has always tried to support the Cuban dissidents. And there's even a guy that I went to college with, undergraduate school, is in prison in Venezuela now. You might have seen his name in the papers. His name is Leopoldo Lopez. He just got sentenced to 13 and a half years. He was the mayor of a small part of Caracas, I think, and was against the Maduro regime, and is going to be in prison presumably for the next 13 years. And I've thought, well, what can I do to help him? And I don't know. I don't know the answer. Anyone else? Got a few more minutes, I think. All right, thanks.
Students at TLU engage in high-impact educational experiences that include civic engagement, aesthetic expression, critical thinking, and a focus on intercultural knowledge in a community that welcomes the interplay of faith and reason.